Right. So today, the topic of our study is the blueprint of end-time events. Just to review, in one of our earlier studies on Matthew 24, we discussed how the Romans came with their legions to the city of Jerusalem, put their standards in the ground, and worshiped the standards as a sign that the city was soon to fall. Okay. We noticed that the standards contained an eagle with outstretched wings and a golden wreath around it representing the sun god Mithra. So the Roman legions were actually worshipping the sun god Mithra as they kneeled before their standards, before their flags, their standards that they had, right? The eagle and sun standard from the Roman legions were the sign for the Christians in Jerusalem to flee the city. And we noted that all those who fled were Sabbath keepers, right? Next, we study in another study and another week that the link between the Roman eagle sun standards and the Great Seal of the United States that also contained an eagle and a sunburst, right? That the standards, they were both similar. We noted that Congress would enact a national Sunday law in the end time, and faithful Sabbath keepers would have to flee from the city, similar to what happened in Jerusalem in AD 7. In our last lesson, last week, we noticed that although the prospect of a national Sunday law seemed impossible in the USA, events in the second half of the 19th century revealed that a national emergency, in a national emergency, such a law is not only possible, but also plausible. It could happen. Now, this is in spite of the fact that the First Amendment of the United States Constitution clearly states that Congress is the place where they enact their laws, can make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, right? Now, in this study, today we will examine the blueprint of how the movement of a national Sunday law will succeed in the future. Now, Mrs. White wrote much about the end time, and she predicted precisely how the Sunday law would meet with success. Now, from the perspective of someone who wrote 130 years ago, Ellen White, whom the Seventh-day Adventist Church, whom we consider our prophet for these times, wrote the book, The Great Controversy. Now, this book is the best commentary that we can find on Matthew 24 and the book of Revelation as well, right? And end time events from a prophetic perspective. Finally, in our next study, that is next week, we will see how the political and religious environments in the 1980s, not far away, 1980s, 1990s mirrored many things that occurred in 1888, the second half of the 19th century. This makes it plausible, very possible, that a repetition in the future is quite certain, could happen. Now, we're going to notice that during the decades of the 80s, 1980s, and 1990s, a movement or several movements arose in the United States using the same basic arguments that were used in the late end of the 19th century, that we studied last week, the 1800s, right? Which shows that in more contemporary times, we could have a religious movement. That there was a religious movement that wanted by the religious leaders back in the 1860s, 1870s, and 1888s. There was a similar movement in the 1980s and 1990s and early 2000s. Then we are also going to have two studies on what is happening now in our time in the year 2020, in the 2020s, right? So let's get on. Let's look at Mrs. White's perspective. She was the prophet. God gave her visions. God gave her information. Her perspective of the end time events, or her blueprint of end time events, And the first thing that we are going to do is provide an outline of the main points that Mrs. White brings to view when she speaks about end time prophecy, right? We will look at an outline, then read statements from Mrs. White on those points, right? On these outlines, and we are going to see how she amplifies these main points. Now, what is going to happen with the papacy and the United States at the end of time? The first point Mrs. White brings to view in a blueprint of end time events is this: the United States will embrace Roman Catholic principles, making an image of the papacy by uniting church and state, thus fulfilling the prophecy of Revelation 13:11 to 18. Now, we have studied this before, but to refresh, the word papacy does not refer to the Roman Catholic Church. The papacy means union of church and state. It is a system that unites church and state. So the deadly wound that the papacy has right now does not mean that the Catholic Church disappeared. What it means is that the papacy lost its ability to use the civil powers of the world to accomplish its purposes, right? To accomplish, in other words, its agenda. Now, currently, we are living in the pause between what the papacy did in the past and what the papacy will do in the future. And Mrs. White outlines that the United States, according to prophecy, the prophecy of Revelation 13:11 to 18, it's going to provide an image. It's going to speak. It's going to give power to the papacy by uniting church and state, the principles on which the papacy is built, right? So that is a first point. The second point is the Protestant churches of the United States will unite on common points of doctrine and waive their theological differences. So they will come together on common points and waive any theological difference that they have. Then set aside their theological differences where they have discrepancies, and they will unite on what they have in common, what is common to them all. The third, the populace, that is the population, instigated by the ministers, will blame social and natural disasters such as wars, pestilences, famines, earthquakes, on those who keep the Sabbath. Matthew 24:6-9 tells us this. As Ahab, then in the Bible, as we found, Ahab blamed Elijah for not having rain at that time, and Nero, he blamed the Christians for the burning of Rome, right? In the 1880s, the social upheaval that brought in the Sunday law movement, the national reform movement, was the Civil War that took place in America, right? Now, church members will instigate, will push their ministers, will be pushed by their ministers, and will blame this natural disasters on those who keep God's holy 7-day Sabbath of rest. In other words, the wars and rumors of wars, the pestilences, famines, earthquakes are going to be blamed on God's people. Now, this is the blueprint for what will happen in the future. Then the next point. Legislators of the United States, in order to secure the favor of the people, will support the Sunday law, right? Revelation 13 describes this as the beast from the earth that speaks. And we have identified the beast before. We know that the United States, all the characteristics the United States has, right? So we can clearly say that the beast from the earth is the United States, right? Politicians fear that they will lose support of the people in elections. They will lose their seats in Congress and the Senate. So they will support Sunday legislation. So there will be a strong push for this. And it is going to come very strangely, very interestingly, it is going to come from the protesters. So listen to these points very carefully, right? So the earth beast will speak like a dragon, and the nation, we all know nations speak through its laws, through its legislative powers. Politicians will fear losing their support of their constituents and their seats in Congress and the Senate, and therefore they will go along with the National Sunday Law. So that is point 4 of Mrs. White's blueprint. Moving on. The political leaders of the Sunday Law movement in 1880 had no idea. They actually had no idea who was driving the agenda. Neither did they understand the consequences of what they desired, what they wanted, right? The same will be true in the final fulfillment of this. So we find that political leaders are not going to be aware of the motives of the religious leaders that are attempting to use them to accomplish their purposes, right? Remember the story of King Ahasuerus in the days of Queen Esther? He had a religious advisor, him, who said you need to destroy all the Jews because their laws are different from any other people's laws. And it's risky to keep anybody around who has different laws. So he tells it to King Ahasuerus. So he suggested to the king to make a law to exterminate, right, all of the Jews, or in other words, in a common term that is used today, to commit genocide. And the king went along. He didn't realize what the agenda was that Haman had. Now, the same is going to happen with the political leaders at the end time. They are not going to have to realize what the agenda of the religious leaders is. And of course, when King Ahasuerus realized the real motivations of Haman, the Bible tells us that the king rose against Haman and he hanged him on the gallows that was supposed to be for Mordecai, right? Now, prophecy tells us in Revelation chapter 17, the same thing is going to happen. The kings, when they wake up, that the kings is the political leaders, to the true agenda, the true motives of the religious leaders, they will turn on the religious leaders of the nation because they have been deceived into enacting a Sunday law. And they didn't realize what the motivation of the religious leaders were. And rude will be the awakening when the kings and the political leaders realize that their religious advisors have deceived them, right? Just like it happened in the past, it's going to take place in the future. That's one of Mrs. White's blueprint. The next one, the religious leaders will press for an amendment to the Constitution of the United States. What is clearly unconstitutional, that is the establishment of Sunday as a national day of rest, the Supreme Court will declare constitutional. Now, if you notice, during the previous president of the United States tenure, he what did they call it? He placed judges in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court judges of alike, right, who were conservative, right? So he tilted the Supreme Court of the United States. Very interesting if you look at it like that, right? Now, next point, the Roman Catholics will unite with the Protestants to lobby for the National Sunday Law. In fact, listen to this very carefully. The Catholics will not initially lobby Congress for a National Sunday Law. See, they work very stealthily behind. But rather, because Revelation 13 tells us it's the land beast that gives the right, gives the dragon voice. So the Protestants will encourage Catholics to help them enact a Sunday law. The beast from the earth will make an image of the first beast in its honor, which represents the papacy. So if you are listening to the chatter that's coming from the national Christian right in the United States, you can see how well these things are falling into place for them to push for a national Sunday law, right? Then Sunday laws will eventually become anti-Sabbath laws. That's the mark of the beast will be imposed. Revelation 13, verses 16 to 17 tell us this. So in other words, not only will Sunday be imposed by law as a day of worship, but people will be forbidden from keeping the Sabbath. Now, obviously, both of those would be unconstitutional, and there would be an infringement of the first two clauses of the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. But remember, these will be enacted in a state of civil unrest, right? So then people tend to, now we saw in the COVID, how even the world got together behind what was taking place, right? So that gave us a good understanding. So what is the first clause of the clause of the First Amendment? What does it tell us? It tells us that Congress can make no law for the establishment of religion, right? So America is a country built on Christian principles, but it's not a Christian country. It's not a Christian country. And the second clause tells us that it cannot also curtail the freedom to worship according to the dictates of conscience. It cannot establish religion nor forbid the free exercise of religion. It's called the freedom to worship, right? It's the freedom to worship. Now, Sunday laws will require the observance of anti-Sabbath observance of Sunday, while anti-Sabbath laws will forbid Sunday observance. Thus, the United States will trample upon the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause of the Constitution, much like Daniel 3 and 6, where these are vivid illustrations of what happens when civil powers establish religion and forbid its free exercise, right? Now, whenever these two clauses are violated, that is the freedom to worship and the establishment where they don't have a religion that they set, we find the result is persecution, as we see clearly in the Bible, Daniel 3 and 6. Daniel 3, chapter 3, we find Nebuchadnezzar, the civil ruler, building a gigantic image and commanding everyone to worship. The king, by establishing religion, what was the result? 3 young men ended up in the fiery furnace. And if God had not come to deliver them, they would have burnt up. So that was persecution. But in Daniel chapter 6, we have another story that illustrates the second phase of this First Amendment to the Constitution. And that is that in Daniel 6, Daniel is forbidden from praying to God. That was not an establishment or religion, but it was prohibition against him practicing his religion the way he wanted to do it, right? And what was the result? Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, and once again, if God hadn't come to protect him and save him, Daniel would have been eaten alive. Now, the clergy, next point is the clergy will use underhanded and devious methods to secure Sunday law legislation. They will not overtly show what their true agenda is behind all of this. Like most of these movements that you see in America that's taking place, and it catches on like wildfire around the world, just go deep down and you'll find that their agendas are far different to what they openly say. That they openly say things be quite harmless, but actually they are very devious, or deep down their motives are far different than what they project it to be. Now moving on. The advocates of Sunday law will link many good social causes with the Sunday law movement. In the 1880s, this was a prohibition, right? The Women's Christian Temperance Union and the third party prohibitionists, who fought for Sunday law, also fought for laws against alcohol. Now, in the future, perhaps the issues would be family, climate change, gender, marriage between man and a woman, and the sanctity of life, which are all good causes. But the deep down, their motives are something that we need to be wary of, right? So these different issues, but the point that the Sunday legislation will be linked to with causes are not necessarily bad. They are good causes. Next is the religious leaders in the United States will clamor for a theocratic style of government. Remember in the 1880s, last week we studied how they wanted a theocratic government, right? The ministers will clamor for the right to be the moral leaders of the nation and will think they have the right to dictate what the government should do in religious affairs. Okay? That's where the danger comes when the church tries to tell the state how they should do things. Now, as in Nehemiah's day, the clergy will clamor that there must be a national Sunday Sabbath strictly enforced by law so that people keep it and they will be saved. Now, the next one, eventually the world will follow. Now, we saw during the COVID how the entire world followed, right? It didn't take very long for them to jump all on the bandwagon. We'll follow in the steps of the United States and enforce a universal Sunday law. Revelation 13:33 tells us that when the deadly wound is healed, the whole world will wander after the beast. Such a possibility seems improbable and impossible now. Will Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists go along? The answer is yes. Miracles and global survival due to natural disasters, wars, terrorism, economic upheaval, climate change will make it mandatory for all nations to go along because the world has become very small, right? Because of global economic the policies that are there, the world has become very small and they will enforce that everyone follows it their foot. So in other words, this will be a global survival. And the Bible tells us that the beast and the false prophet are going to perform signs and wonders. So people are going to say these signs and wonders are definitely evidence of God, that God is with this movement. So the natural disasters and social disasters and the miracles that are taking place will lead people to believe that God is on the side of the entire world in enacting the Sunday law, right? Now, God's people, next one, who refuse to keep the Sunday law and insist on keeping the Sabbath will lose their civic rights, suffer persecution, and they will not be able to buy and sell, and eventually they'll be sentenced to death, right? Now, those are the blueprints that Mrs. White brings out in her study. So prophecy tells us that this is going to happen, and we can know that prophecy is going to be fulfilled because Jesus says, I have told you these things beforehand so that when they occur, you might believe. So Jesus has given us ample information in the Bible and in spirit of prophecy that could make us aware of what is going to happen. So those of us who are thinking that this is a preposterous, that this would never happen, please remember what we are studying today. And when you see it hammering, remember this study series of Matthew 24. And just be sure that you're on the right side of this issue, right? So now let's unpack what Mrs. White had to say by reading several statements from her writing. Now, Mrs. White wrote these statements in a way that makes this explanation so clear, right? Because God gave her vision. She understood it, so she wrote it down clearly. Now, let's take each of these points individually and see what Mrs. White perceived the end of time scenario to be. Okay, starting with the union of church and state. Let's read. Someone likes to read Great Controversy, page 442.
Such action, a nation Sunday law, would be directly contrary to the principles of this government, to the genius of its free institutions, to the direct and solemn words of the declarations of independence, and to the Constitution. The founders of the nation wisely sought to guard against the employment of secular power on the part of the church, with its inevitable results, intolerance and persecution. The Constitution provides that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, and that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office of public trust under the United States. Only in flagrant violations of these safeguards to the nations is liberty can any religious observance be enforced by civil authority. But the inconsistency of such action is no greater than is represented in the symbol. It is the beast with the lamb-like horn in profession, pure, gentle, and harmless, that speaks as a dragon.
So now it's not going to get rid of the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, but by making Sunday laws and enforcing them, then the law is going to contradict the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. It will profess one thing, but its actions will do something different, right? That is what is going to happen. Now, in the Great Controversy, in the book Great Controversy, page 581, this is what she wrote about the union of church and state.
That the principle once be established in the United States that the church may employ or control the power of the state, that religious observance may be enforced by secular laws. In short, that the authority of church and state is to dominate the conscience, and the triumph of Rome in this country is assured.
Okay. Now, when she speaks of Rome here, she's talking about papal Rome, right? Now, join church and state in the United States, and the victory of Rome is absolutely assured, she says, right? Absolutely assured in the United States of America, because the main characteristics of the papacy, the meaning of the word is union of church and state, using the church to influence the state to implement the church's agenda, because the church doesn't have the civil power, doesn't have the civil doesn't have the civil powers, the military powers to enact what she wants, right? So remember that. Then notice Great Controversy 6:15. Let me read that, and then I'll ask Ambis to read the next. As the Sabbath has become a special point of controversy throughout Christendom, and religious and secular authorities have combined to enforce the observance of Sunday, the persistent refusal of a small minority to yield to the popular demand will make them objects of universal expression, right? Another statement from the book Evangelism. Ambit, would you like to read that?
Yeah. When Protestant churches shall unite with the secular power to sustain a false religion, for opposing which their ancestors endured the fiercest persecution, then will the papal Sabbath be enforced by the combined authority of church and state. There will be a national apostasy which will end only in national ruin.
Okay, so now we have heard that national apostasy and with national ruin is the desolation, right? Is the desolation that we have studied in this Matthew 24 before, right? Now in volume 5 of the Testimonies, page 712, Mrs. White wrote this: the National Reform Movement, exercising the power of religious legislation, will, when fully developed, manifest the same intolerance and oppression that have prevailed in the past ages. Human councils then assume the prerogative of deity, crushing under their despotic power liberty of conscience, and imprisonment, exile, and death follow for those who oppose their dictate. If popery or its principles shall again be legislated into power, the fires of persecution will be rekindled against those who will not sacrifice conscience and the truth in deference to the popular errors. This evil is on the point of realization. Now she is talking because this, remember what we studied last week, it took place in 1888. So she's speaking about this, right? the National Reform Movement, which was gathering quite a lot of steam in the latter half of the 19th century, right? So that is what she's talking about here. She's talking about it. Later we'll find that she says, okay, that didn't happen, but this is definitely going to happen in the future. Now, blinded to the results, Mrs. White also wrote that the political leaders will be oblivious to the real agenda and the results of Sunday legislation. They will think that Sunday legislation is a great idea because we will return to God. People will go back to church. And in this way, the calamities in nature and the calamities in society will be turned aside and God will bless his people again. But the opposite is going to happen. Why? Because this is a return to church by obligation. And it is contrary to what God teaches in his holy word, right? If he said everybody should observe Sabbath, not by law, but by voluntarily, but voluntary, that would be fine, right? People make their own decisions whether they want to keep the Sabbath. But telling people that they have to violate God's holy law and keep a day that the fourth commandment doesn't tell us to keep is apostasy. And they don't see the results of that. Let's read Testimonies for the Church, volume 5, page 711. What she has to say there.
There are many, even of those engaged in this movement for Sunday enforcement, who are blinded to the results which will follow this action. They do not see that they are striking directly against religious liberty.
Then in the next one, Review and Herald, January 1, 1889.
There is a satanic force propelling the Sunday movement, but it is concealed. Even the men who are engaged in the work are themselves blinded to the results which will follow their movement. Okay,
so here she's talking about who is behind these laws. Clearly she's saying satanic forces, right? Now they themselves who are pushing for this movement are blinded to the results which will follow their movement. In other words, it will lead to a national ruin because it's an abomination in the sight of God, right? Remember Ezekiel chapter 8, it tells us the greatest abomination was being committed among those who professed to serve God was that the leaders had their back to the temple of God and they were worshipping the sun towards the east, right? Now that was the greatest abomination. And it will be the greatest abomination at the end of time too. Changing God's holy law by human legislation, right? Very serious. Now in volume 4 of Testimonies, page 452, Mrs. White wrote this. The Sunday movement is now making its way in darkness. The leaders are concealing the true issue. And many who unite in the movement do not themselves see whether the undercurrent is trending. Its professions are mild and apparently Christian, but when it shall speak, it will reveal the spirit of the dragon. So who is behind all of this? Satan. So on top, it seems a good reason, a good thing to do, but actually the agenda behind it is Satan. Now the next one is Protestants will stretch their hands to the papers. Very interesting. This. Let's read Maranatha, page 179.
Protestants will throw their whole influence and strength on the side of papacy. By a national act enforcing the false Sabbath, they will give life and vigor to the corrupt faith of Rome, reviving Revelation 13:3, tyranny and oppressions of conscience.
Okay. So now what is a national act? A national act is an act of Congress, a law that is passed in Congress, right? We cannot revive something that hasn't died. So the papacy received a deadly wound, but we are told here the Protestants will help the papacy to revive, to come back to life again. Now, great controversy, page 566.
I read.
Yeah, go ahead.
Protestants have tampered with and patronized popery. They have made compromises and concessions which papists themselves are surprised to see and fail to understand. Men are closing their eyes to the real character of Romanism and the dangers to be apprehended from her supremacy. The people need to be aroused to resist the advances of this most dangerous foe to civil and religious liberty.
That interesting? She states that the papacy will not take the initiative in the Sunday law. Protestants will, and then they will request the aid of the popery. Isn't that something? Now we always think that it's the papacy that's going to push it, but actually, when you study Revelation 13, as we have studied, it is the land beast who gives her the voice, right? So we find the apostate Protestantism is what's going to push for the Sunday laws, and then they're going to ask the papacy for their aid, which they will gladly give. Now, in the like we were just reading in Spalding and Magan, page 1 and 2, Mrs. White tells this, that how the Protestants take the initiative and the Catholics will tell them to go ahead with it. Let's read that in.
I saw that the two-horned beast, the earth beast of Revelation 13, 11 to 18, had a dragon's mouth, and that his power was in his head, and that the decree would go out of his mouth. A nation speaks through its legislative and judicial authorities. Then I saw the mother of harlots, that the mother was not the daughters, but separate and distinct from them. She has had her day, and it is past during the 1260 years, and her daughters, the Protestant sects, were the next to come on the stage. The beast of Revelation 13, verses 11 to 18, and act out the same mind that the mother had when she persecuted the saints. The second beast does everything to honor the first. I saw that as the mother has been declining in power, the daughters had been growing and soon they will exercise the power once exercised by the mother.
Wow, isn't that something? You know, we have always not thought that the push for Sunday laws will come by the Protestants, but clearly the push for Sunday laws is going to come by the Protestants, and then they ask the papacy for help, which they gladly give, right? Because like prophecy tells us, it's the land beast that gives its authority and its power and its voice to the papacy. Now, again from Spalding, a Magan collection. Let's read the next one.
I saw the nominal church and nominal Adventists, like Judas, would betray us to the Catholics to obtain their influence of Catholics to come against the truth. The saints then will be an obscure people, little known to the Catholics, but the churches and the nominal Adventists who know of our faith and customs, for they hated us on the account of the Sabbath, for they could not refute it, will betray the saints and report them to the Catholics as those who disregard the institutions of the people, that is, that they keep the Sabbath and disregard Sunday.
Awesome, isn't that an amazing statement? Wow, you need to be careful of the nominal Adventists. Next one, next paragraph.
Next, then the Catholics beat the Protestants to go forward and issue a decree that all who will not observe the first day of the week instead of the seventh day shall be slain. And the Catholics, whose numbers are large, will stand by the Protestants. The Catholics will give their power to the image of the beast, and the Protestant will walk as their mother walked before them to destroy the saints. But before their decree bring all bear fruit, the saints will be delivered by the voice of God.
Right? Actually, we never put it like that into that context. Now, in volume 5 of Testimonies, page 711 and 712, Mrs. White wrote this.
Any movement
Go ahead.
Any movement in favor of religious legislation is really an act of concession to the papacy, which for so many ages has steadily warred against liberty of conscience. Sunday observance owes its existence as a so-called Christian institution to the mystery of iniquity, and its enforcement will be a virtual recognition of the principles which are the very cornerstone of Romanism. When our nation shall so abjure the principles of its government as to enact a Sunday law, Protestantism will in this act join hands with popery. It will be nothing else than giving life to the tyranny which has long been eagerly watching its opportunity to spring again into active and despotism.
Now notice the terminology she uses. She says it will be nothing else than giving life. Why? Because the papacy currently has a deadly wound, right? Currently the papacy is inactive. Now we are in that pause period between the two phases of the tribulation. The past phase was AD 538 to 1798, and the future phase, which is right before the close of probation, right? So the Protestant will give life to the papacy. Interesting. Now, next point, uniting on common points of doctrine, right? They're going to set aside the issues on which they don't agree, and they're going to join together with those that they do it. Let's read Great Controversy, Great Controversy, page 455, not volume 5, 455, chapter 5.
When the leading churches of the United States, united upon such points of doctrine as are held by them in common, shall influence the state to enforce their decrees and to sustain their institutions, then Protestant America will have formed an image of the Roman hierarchy, and the infliction of civil penalties upon dissenters will inevitably result.
Next one.
The wide diversity of belief in the Protestant churches is regarded by many as decisive proof that no effort to secure a forced uniformity can ever be made. However, there has been 4 years in churches, the Protestant faith, a strong and growing statement in favor of the union based upon common points of doctrine. To secure such a union, the discussions of subjects upon which all were not agreed, however important they might be from a Bible standpoint, must necessarily be wave.
Wow. So what are they going to unite on? What are the common doctrines that both of these, the Roman Catholics and the Protestants have? The doctrines will be Sunday, right? Sanctity of Sunday and the immortality of the soul, right? Which the Catholics and Protestants, virtually all Protestants share in common, right? That the soul doesn't die, it keeps going on and it goes all over. Those are two common things that they will unite on. While the others that are biblically correct, they will waver just so that they can unite on a common platform, as it were, right? Strange things will happen, they say. Now, this is another statement from Great Controversy 563.
There is an increase in indifference concerning the doctrines that separate the Reformed churches from the papal hierarchy. The opinion is gaining ground that, after all, we do not differ so widely upon vital points as has been supposed, and that a little concession on our part will bring us into a better understanding with Rome.
Mm-hmm. Actually, we see this, right? The Lutherans, the other Protestant denominations are getting very cozy and comfortable with the papacy, whom they oppose, that protested against, right? Because they think, okay, let's get together. And the papacy's main thing is we got to love. Love is the most important thing, not doctrine. So based on those, they are going to unite. Clearly, she says. Now, the role of the clergy. Mrs. White wrote about the role of the clergy in securing a national Sunday law. Interesting. Let's read Review and Herald, December 24, 1889.
Plans of serious import to the people of God are advancing in an underhand manner among the clergymen of various denominations, and the object of this sacred maneuvering is to win popular favor for the enforcement of Sunday sacredness. If the people can be led to favor a Sunday law, then the clergy intend to exert their united influence to obtain a religious amendment to the Constitution and compel the nation to keep Sunday.
Now, does this remind us of the times of Jesus? Was it not the populists that came up with the idea of crucifying Christ? It was actually the religious leaders, if you go back to the Bible, right, of that day and age, that instigated the people to clamor for the death of Jesus, right? They are the ones who instigated. They are the ones who are behind it all. Now, the people need to learn to think for themselves, right? We as the people don't just believe everything that we hear. We need to compare what we hear with what God says in His holy word. We have to compare what is being said with what God says. If what God says is contrary to what the preachers are preaching from the pulpit, then we don't accept it because it's contrary to the Bible. So we need to be students of the Bible. We need to study so that we know. That's the reason why we need to be aware of what the Bible says so that we will not be deceived. Next one. Politicians will accede to the popular demand, right? I mean, it's very common that politicians will do anything to maintain their seats, right? So Mrs. White also states that politicians will accede to the popular demand, or they will give in to popular demands. Many of them might not believe that it's a good idea. Many might believe that it's unconstitutional. Yet they will go along with the Sunday law that the religious leaders want. She gives reasons why this will happen. Let's read. Great Controversy, page 592.
The dignitaries of church and state will unite to bribe, persuade, or compel all classes to honor the Sunday. The lack of divine authority will be supplied by oppressive enactments. Political corruption is destroying love of justice and regard for truth, and even in free America, rulers and legislators, in order to secure public favor, will yield to the popular demand for a law enforcing Sunday observance. Liberty of conscience, which has caused so great a sacrifice, will no longer be respected.
Okay, so for them to get their votes to be elected, they will do anything. Then Fundamentals of Christian Education, page 475. 75, this is what Mrs. writes.
We cannot labor to please men who will use their influence to repress religious liberty and to set in operation oppressive measures to lead or compel their fellow men to keep Sunday as the Sabbath. The first day of the week is not a day to be reverenced. It is a spurious Sabbath, and the members of the Lord's family cannot participate with the men who exalt this day and violate the law of God by trampling upon his Sabbath. The people of God are not to vote to place such men in office, for when they do this, they are partakers with them of the sins which they commit while in office.
Wow, did you catch that last one? When we vote in people, we have to be careful whom we vote in. Or she says we will be part of the sins that they commit when they are in office.
Yes.
Good to remember, right? Now,
Mm.
the next is the efforts to introduce religious curriculum. Now, America is not a Christian nation, though it is established on Christian principles, right? Now, there is a push to bring Christianity into public schools. Now, private schools are established on different laws and principles and constitutions, but public schools, you cannot have the state telling you what to do, right? So Mrs. White discussed the issue of introducing religious curriculum into public schools. Remember all these details because we are going to do a lesson on the events that took place, like I said, in the 1980s and 1990s and 2000. And we're going to find that a movement in very recent past was clamoring for the same thing that Mrs. White wrote so many years ago. Let's read the Watchman, May 1, 1906.
The present effort of the church to get the state to introduce the teaching of Christianity into state schools is but a revival of the doctrine of force in religious things, and as such it is anti-Christian.
Now, was Mrs. White a secular humanist or an atheist? Because she wrote this, no. She's respecting the First Amendment that America has, not to establish a religion. Give people the freedom of choice, the freedom of liberty to choose whom they want. Because God doesn't want people worshiping him because of enactments. He wants us to worship him through a conviction and a conversion and a desire in our hearts, right? Now, in letter 44 of 1893, this is what she had to say.
I do not see the justice nor right in enforcing by law the bringing of the Bible to be read in the public schools.
Now, if we recall, I think we all should remember, remember we heard people say God is kicked out of public school, and when students were told that they couldn't actually bring a Bible to school. Now, that's not true. The school cannot legislate the reading of the Bible, because it would be unconstitutional. But students are free to come to school with their Bible. They can even form voluntary study groups to study the Bible. They can get groups of students together to pray, as long as it's not mandated by the government. Now, that is where the problem comes. When the government mandates that children should study this and this in school, that is the problem. But otherwise, in any school, in any university, especially now in Australia and Monash, they have these student Christian movements there, like small movements, that they have their own groups, they have their own things, so that The children can, that's why it's called campus ministry. They have small groups for students who show interest in study that they meet in little care group, right? So that is possible, but as long as the government doesn't enact it by law, then there is no problem. So now that was the push in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, and I think we can really recall it. And many of us thought that was, I remember many saying, that is good, you have to put the 10 commandments in that. The government can't tell us to do that. They haven't the right. But if we choose to do it individually, it should be something that people choose individually to do. Nobody can force us to do, because that is going against the American Constitution. Now, linked to good causes. Very interesting. Mrs. White, she talks about what happened. Here she's talking about what took place in 1888. She was an eyewitness to this. Let's see what she has to say in the Great Controversy, page 587 and 588.
Here, the temperance walk, one of the most prominent and important of moral reforms, is often combined with the Sunday movement, and the advocates of the latter represent themselves as laboring to promote the highest interests of society, and those who refuse to unite with them are denounced as the enemies of the temperance and reform. However, the fact that a movement to establish error is connected with a work which is in itself good is not an argument in favor of the error. We may disguise poison by mingling it with wholesome food, but we do not change its nature. On the contrary, we render it more dangerous, as it is more likely to take people unawares. It is one of Satan's devices to combine with falsehood just enough truth to give it possibility. The leaders of the Sunday movement may advocate reforms which the people need, principles which are in harmony with the Bible. Yet, while there is with these a requirement which is contrary to God's law, his servants cannot unite with them. Nothing can justify them in setting aside the commandments of God for the precepts of men.
So you and I have to be very careful when these movements come out with good, they seem good on top, to find out exactly what their hidden agendas are. Now, God's people are going to be blamed. God's people are going to be blamed for what's happening in the world, for the turmoil and the natural disasters, etc. Let's read what she has to say in Great Controversy, page 590.
Those who honor the Bible Sabbath will be denounced as enemies of law and order, as breaking down the moral restraints of society, causing anarchy and corruption, and calling down the judgments of God, Matthew 24, verse 9, upon the earth. Their conscientious scruples will be pronounced obstinacy, stubbornness, and contempt of authority. They will be accused of disaffection toward the government. Ministers who deny the obligation of the divine law will present from the pulpit the duty of yielding obedience to the civil authorities as ordained of God. In legislative halls and courts of justice, commandment keepers will be misrepresented and condemned.
Wow, right? So they will they will start accusing the true Sabbath keepers and they will blame them for all the disasters. Now, she saw the Sunday law as impending in a day that was during the 1888 because there was this movement that we studied. So they were looking to amend the constitution, right? So she's talking about what taking place in 1888 and she had been saying that there was going to be a national Sunday law. Well, it didn't happen and she realized that it didn't. But it doesn't mean that the idea died there. The idea is just resting. Let's see what Testimonies to the Church, Volume 5, page 711 has to say about that.
A great crisis awaits the people of God. A crisis awaits the world. The most momentous struggle of all the ages is just before us. Events which for more than 40 years we have, upon the authority of the prophetic word declared to be impending, are now taking place before our eyes. Already the question of an amendment to the Constitution restricting liberty of conscience has been urged upon the legislators of the nation. The question of enforcing Sunday observance has become one of national interest and importance.
We saw that clearly in last week's study, right? Now, let's see what she has to say, Review and Herald, December 11, 1888.
They do not see that if a Protestant government sacrifices the principles that have made nation and through legislation brings into the Constitution principles that will propagate paper falsehood and paper delusion, they are plunging into the Roman horrors of dark ages.
Now, some might say that she's speaking in hyperbole or in exaggeration, but I don't think so. We just need to wait and see how these things will play out. Because one thing we need to know is never forget history, because history has, if we forget history, history has a way of repeating itself, right? So what she's saying is reminding us of the dark ages, and when the papacy has the full control of the state, that is what will take place. Then the next one, she then realized that during her time, the Sunday law might not be passed, right, at that particular time. So then this is what she says in Testimonies for the Church, Volume 5, page 713.
It may be that the respite may yet be granted for God's people to await and let their light shine. If the presence of 10 righteous persons would have saved the wicked cities of the plain, is it not possible that God will yet, in answer to the prayers of his people, hold in check the working of those who are making void his law? Shall we not humble our hearts greatly before God, flee to the mercy seat, and plead with him to reveal his mighty power?
And then Mrs. White realized that in 1905 that it was not going to happen, but she knew in 1905 that eventually, someday in the future, it was going to take place. Let's read Review and Herald, February 16, 1905.
Sooner or later, Sunday law will be passed. However, there is much for God's servants to do to warn the people. This work has been greatly retarded by their having to wait and stand against the devising of Satan, which have been striving to find a place in our work. We are years behind. The review,
Tribune Herald, February 16, 1905. Now, pro-Sunday and anti-Sabbath, right? That was the next one. Ms. White also stated that not only will pro-Sunday laws be established, but also anti-Sabbath laws, anti-7-day Sabbath laws. Let's read what she had to say in the Southern Work, page 69.
the time will come when men will not only forbid Sunday work, but they will try to force men to labor on the Sabbath, and men will be asked to renounce the Sabbath and to subscribe to Sunday observance or forfeit their freedom and their lives. But the time for this has not yet come, for the truth must be presented more fully before the people as a witness. Ellen G. White, the Southern Work, page 69.
Then the next one is the whole world will unite, right? Now, earlier, before COVID, it seemed impossible. But after COVID, I think all of us realized that it is possible. Let's read what she has to say in Maranatha, page 217.
The whole world is to be stirred up with enmity against Seventh-day Adventists, because they will not yield homage to the papacy, but by honoring Sunday. The institutions of this anti-Christian power, it is the purpose of Satan to cause them to be blotted from the earth, in order that his supremacy of the world may not be disputed.
Next one, Testimonies for the Church, volume 6, page 18.
As America, the land of religious liberty, shall unite with the papacy in forcing the conscience and compelling men to honor the false Sabbath, the people of every country on the globe will be led to follow her example.
Wow, every country on the globe will follow the example of the United States. Interesting, isn't it? Next one, Selected Messages, volume 3, page 392.
The so-called Christian world is to be the theater of great and decisive actions. Men in authority will enact laws controlling the conscience after the example of the papacy. Babylon will make all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Every nation will be involved.
Why will every nation be involved? Why? Because there will be a global emergency, right? Something that we never heard of before COVID, right? 19. Not a national emergency merely, but a global emergency where everybody in the world gets involved in it, right? Because all of these things are taking place at that time, right? So then they will all come together to find a solution for them to exist, as it were. Now let's read Testimonies for the Church, volume 6, page 395.
Foreign nation will follow the example of the United States. Though she leads out, yet the same crisis will come upon our people in all parts of the world.
We can understand that clearly now. Selected Messages, volume 3, page 427 and 428.
The wicked declared that they had the truth, that miracles were among them, that angels from heaven talked with them and walked with them. The great power and signs and wonders were performed among them, and that this was the temporal millennium that they had been expecting so long. The whole world was converted and in harmony with the Sunday law.
Just imagine in your mind that picture, Satan will have all these miracles and bringing down fire and all this, so that will convince people, if they are not grounded in the truth, that this what is happening, the Sunday law is but God wants. Now moving on, the role of our ministers. So what is to be the Seventh Adventist response to all of this? Ellen White gave counsel to the ministers of the Seventh Adventist Church in Testimonies, Volume 5, page 715.
Not all our ministers who are giving the third angel's message really understand what constitutes that message. The national reform movement has been regarded by some as of so little importance that they have not thought it necessary to give much attention to it, and have even felt that in so doing, they would be giving time to questions distinct from the third angel's message. May the Lord forgive our brethren for thus interpreting the very message for this time. The people need to be aroused in regard to the dangers of the present time. The watchmen are asleep. We are years behind.
Wow. Quite an admonition, right, to our ministers. Now, next question. What is wrong with the church using the state? Right? What is it that would actually bring a change to society? Is it more laws, more police, more surveillance that would lead to peace and harmony in society? Why is it wrong for the church and state to join together? Now, this is a bit of a lengthy statement that we are going to read. It's from the book, The Desire of Ages, page 509 to 510. And it's a powerful statement by Mrs. White, writes about why it's wrong, it's dangerous for the church using the state.
But today in the religious world, there are multitudes who, as they believe, are working for the establishment of the kingdom of Christ as an earthly and temporal dominion. They desire to make our Lord the ruler of the kingdoms of the world, the ruler in its courts and camps, its legislative halls, its places and markets places. They expect him to rule through legal enactments enforced by human authority. Since Christ is not here in person, they themselves will undertake to act in his stead, to execute the laws of his kingdom. The establishment of such a kingdom is what the Jews desired in the days of Christ. They would have received Jesus had he been willing to establish a temporal dominion to enforce that what they regarded as the laws of God, and to make them the expositors of his will and the agents of his authority. However, he said, "My kingdom is not of this world." He would not accept the earthly throne.
Very clearly, we must remember that Jesus said his kingdom is not of this world, right? So trying to bring in these things are not God's plan, right? Now, here comes some very important section of this statement in this next paragraph. Let's read that.
The government under which Jesus lived was corrupt and oppressive. On every hand were crying abuses, extortion, intolerance, and grinding cruelty. Yet the Savior attempted no civil reforms. He attacked no national abuses, nor condemned the national enemies. He did not interfere with the authority or administration of those in power. He who was our example kept aloof from earthly governments, not because he was indifferent to the woes of men, but because the remedy did not lie in merely human and external measures. To be efficient, the cure must reach man individually and must regenerate the heart.
Oh, now, did we ever see Jesus picketing or demonstrating or rioting to get society to change. No. Jesus cared, but he knew the solution was not legal enactment. Now, there is a big debate about racism in the United States, all over. We need to understand that we cannot make someone who is a racist not a racist by legislation. We cannot enact laws for them not to be. The change, Jesus says, has to come from the individual hearts, right? So laws can be made so that external society can function. But we cannot change a person's heart from being a racist to not being a racist by law. The heart needs to be changed. And that is what Jesus wants. He wants our hearts to be changed. Of course, there are laws to keep people, society safe, but that laws are not going to change people because their hearts will not be changed. Okay, the final part of that quotation.
Not by the decisions of courts or councils or legislative assemblies, not by the patronage of worldly great men, is the kingdom of Christ established, but by the implanting of Christ's nature in humanity through the work of the Holy Spirit. As many as receive him, to them give he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name, which were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but God. John chapter 1, verse 12 and 13. Here is the only power that can work the uplifting of mankind, and the human agency for the accomplishment of this work is the teaching and practicing of the word of God.
So clearly she says society doesn't change by what happens on Capitol Hill, but rather by what happens in the home, in the school, in the church. Human legislation does not change the heart. It's the Holy Spirit who changes the heart. It is the Holy Spirit who writes God's law there. Now, when the early church lost the spirit and power of God, society fell apart. The church, seeing that things were getting out of hand, decided to appeal to the arm of the state to correct the situation. And the result was apostasy and persecution. So for us, we have to remember very clearly, what changes is not the laws that will change people. It will just inhibit people and corral them, as it were. But what changes and makes society better is the Holy Spirit changing in our hearts.